Vareth the dragon had lived on Ashen Ridge for centuries, gray-scaled and ancient beyond any villager's memory. Once he had been fearsome, but time and hunger had whittled him down to something the village of Crestholm found amusing. They called him harmless, and in their small cruelty, they were almost right. There was a time when the name Vareth had meant something. Travelers who passed through the mountain roads would lower their voices when they spoke it, the way people lower their voices in temples and graveyards, not out of reverence exactly, but out of an instinct older than language, a recognition that some things in the world were large enough to deserve quiet. Caravans had once rerouted entirely to avoid the shadow of Ashen Ridge. Knights had come seeking glory against him and had returned home, missing pieces of themselves, humbled in ways that no tournament or battlefield had managed. Vareth had been written into the margins of maps with ink mixed from fear and respect in equal measure. That was before. Now the maps didn't mention him at all, and the travelers laughed. The centuries had not been kind to him in the way they are never kind to anything that persists too long without the things it needs. His gray scales, once the color of storm clouds building over open ocean, had dulled to the flat ash gray of cold hearths. The great musculature that had once moved beneath them like weather had thinned and sunken, pulling tight over a frame that felt, on bad mornings, as fragile as old pottery. His amber eyes still held their depth. That much the years had not taken. But even they had grown quieter, turned inward, the way eyes do when there is less and less outside worth the full weight of attention. The hunger was the worst of it. Not the embarrassment, not the loneliness, not the laughter that drifted up the ridge road on market days like smoke from someone else's fire. The hunger sat inside him like a stone, constant and patchy. His ribs pressed against his scales like knuckles under cloth, and his fire came out in weak, sputtering coughs. The herds had abandoned the ridge, the fields were fenced with iron, and the river offered him nothing but cold water and humiliation. Vareth had not eaten a proper meal in 3 months, and the cold season showed no intention of ending. He had tried, in the early weeks of the cold season, to hunt as he once had. He had descended from the ridge in the gray, pre-dawn hours, moving through the forest with what stealth a creature of his size could manage, tracking the scent of deer through the frozen undergrowth. He had found their trails, followed them to the lower meadows, and arrived each time to discover nothing but hoofprints in the frost and the faint, mocking warmth of where they had just been. The herds had learned him, learned the particular sound his claws made on stone, the direction the wind carried his scent, the way the birds went silent in the trees just before he appeared. They had adjusted. He had not been fast enough, or quiet enough, or lucky enough. And after a while, the trying itself had become a kind of additional humiliation he could not afford. The river had been its own defeat. He had stood in the shallows on a morning in early winter, watching the dark water move around his legs, waiting for the silver flash of fish the way he had done 100 years ago when the river had been generous. The fish came, small ones, quick ones, and his reflexes, once sharp enough to pluck birds from the air mid-flight, had slowed to something closer to wishful thinking. He had snapped at the water twice and caught nothing but cold and the distant sound of a farmer's boy on the bank who had witnessed it and run home to tell the story. The iron fences along the lower fields were the final border drawn against him. Deliberate and quiet, as effective as a wall, the cold did not care about any of it. It settled into the ridge, into... The merchants who traveled the ridge road threw him stale bread crusts the way men throw scraps to stray dogs. They laughed as the great dragon lumbered from the shadows to collect what little they offered, his dignity trailing behind him like a broken wing. The children of Crestholm had a rhyme about him, and none of its words were kind. It had begun gradually, the way most cruelties begin, not with intention, but with the slow accumulation of small moments that eventually harden into habit. The first merchant to throw a crust had done it nervously, a reflex offering to a creature he wasn't sure was dangerous, the way a man might toss food to an unfamiliar dog blocking his path. Vareth had taken it because he was hungry, and hunger has a way of negotiating very efficiently with pride. The merchant had laughed. Surprised by his own boldness, surprised that the great dragon had accepted so small a thing so readily. He had told the story at the next inn, and the story had traveled faster than he had. After that, the throwing became a ritual. Merchants made a game of it, seeing who could land a crust closest to the tree line, taking bets on whether Vareth would emerge at all, cheering when he did with the same energy men bring to watching performing animals at a fair. They did not think of it as cruelty. They thought of it as entertainment, which is often how cruelty survives long enough to become tradition. Vareth came out each time because he had no choice, and each time the laughter followed him back into the shadows like something attached to his heels. And the children's rhyme had been composed by no one in particular and belonged to everyone, as such rhymes always do. It had verses about his cough, about the crescent tear in his wing, about the salmon story that may or may not have been true. They sang it at the well and in the schoolyard, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, loud enough that it carried up the ridge road on the wind. Vareth bore the mockery in silence, not because it didn't reach him, but because he had learned patience the way mountains learn it. He had watched kingdoms built from mud and collapsed back into it, had seen gods rise and be forgotten inside a single century. But hunger, unlike laughter, did not care how ancient or patient you were. Silence had not always been his nature. There was a version of Vareth, centuries deep in the past, who had answered mockery with fire and answered disrespect with the kind of demonstration that left a lasting impression on the landscape. He had been younger then, and full, and the fullness had made certain responses feel reasonable in the way that only strength can make destruction feel reasonable. He had not been cruel, exactly. He had simply been powerful, and power has its own logic that patience has not yet had the chance to correct. The patience had come slowly, layered over decades the way stone layers itself, one quiet year pressed against another until the weight of accumulated time became its own kind of stability. He had watched the kingdom of Ardenmoor rise from a collection of river settlements into something with walls and banners and a king who wore a gold circle on his head as though the circle conferred something the man did not already either have or lack. He had watched that same kingdom fracture along the lines of succession, watched the walls crumble and the banners rot, and the gold circle pass through so many hands it eventually meant nothing at all. He had watched 3 religions replace one another on the same hill, and each one certain it was the final and correct version of the truth. He had watched, and he had learned that certainty was the first thing time dismantled, and that everything loud eventually went quiet. This was the philosophy that carried him through the laughter and the crusts and the children's rhyme. He told himself that Crestholm too would pass, that these small, brief people— Edric Voss arrived in Crestholm on a gray afternoon with a lame horse, empty pockets, and exhaustion behind his eyes. He had soldiered for 11 years, not as a hero, just as a man who showed up and survived when others didn't. The war had ended, and the world, he discovered, had little use for a man whose only real skill was not dying. He had enlisted at 19, for reasons that made more sense at 19 than they did now. There had been something in the recruitment sergeant's speech about honor and kingdom and the particular kind of future available to men willing to earn it with their hands. Edric had listened and had felt the words land in the specific empty place inside a young man that is always waiting for something large enough to fill it. He had signed his name the same afternoon, as before the feeling had time to cool into doubt. 11 years had not made him a hero. They had made him practical. He had learned to sleep in mud and eat things that did not deserve the word food. He had learned to read weather and terrain and the specific quality of silence that meant danger was close. He had learned to stay calm when everything around him was the opposite of calm, to move steadily through chaos with the mechanical focus of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that panic was simply an expense he could not afford. He had carried wounded men further than wounded men should be carried. He had made decisions in bad moments that he still turned over in his mind on sleepless nights, examining them from every angle, never quite arriving at peace with all of them. He had survived, so which was the thing the recruiters had not mentioned would become its own kind of burden. When the war ended, the regiment disbanded with handshakes and a coin purse that lasted him 6 weeks. He had tried 3 towns before Crestholm, a carpenter's assistant in one, a stable hand in another, a brief and unsuccessful attempt at farming in the third. Each toe, the innkeeper gave him a roof in exchange for splitting firewood, and Edric accepted without a word of complaint. On his 3rd morning, hauling the axe out to the yard, he saw the shape of Vareth on the ridge through the cold mist. He stood still for a long time, just looking, in the way of a man who recognized something without yet knowing what it was. The arrangement suited him. The innkeeper, a broad, practical man named Holt, had looked Edric over in the way innkeepers look over men who arrive with nothing and asked for work instead of charity, measuring not just the shoulders and the hands, but the quality of stillness in the face, whether it was the stillness of a man who was steady or the stillness of a man who was simply waiting for an opportunity to be otherwise. Whatever Holt had found in the assessment, it had satisfied him enough to point toward the woodpile without further conversation. Edric had appreciated that. He had very little left to spend on explaining himself to strangers. The first 2 mornings had been only work, the clean, uncomplicated rhythm of the axe coming down, the wood splitting, the stacking. There was something honest about it that Edric found easier than most things he had done in recent months. It asked nothing of him beyond the physical, offered nothing beyond the immediate, and when it was done there was a stack of wood that had not existed before, which was a more satisfying result than many of his last 11 years had managed to produce. The 3rd morning the mist was thick and low over the valley, softening the edges of everything, and Edric had carried the axe out into the yard and stopped. And the shape on the ridge was enormous, even through the gray haze, a darkness that was wrong for a tree, wrong for a rock formation, wrong for anything the natural landscape should have produced at that scale. It was still in the way that very large things are still, with the particular quality of stillness that is That evening the men at the inn's common table told dragon stories, each one ending in laughter louder than the last. Edric drank his ale slowly and did not laugh, which made the man beside him ask if he felt sorry for the creature. "I've seen what starving looks like," Edric said quietly. "I don't much like seeing it on anything." The common room was warm, in the way only inn common rooms manage on cold evenings. The fire too large for the hearth. The bodies too many for the space. The noise bouncing off the low ceiling until it became a single, comfortable roar that made thinking optional and belonging easy. Men who had nothing particular in common found common ground in the ale and the warmth, and the dragon stories were the kind of shared currency that passed easily around a table full of strangers. The salmon story came first, told by a farmer with a red face and excellent timing, and the table responded as the table always responded, with the laughter of men who had heard it before and were glad to hear it again. Then came a story about Vareth attempting to intimidate a wool merchant who had, apparently, simply ignored him and continued loading his cart. And this one produced an even better response because the merchant was known to several men at the table, and his particular brand of unflappable stubbornness made the image funnier than it might otherwise have been. Edric listened to all of it without expression, turning his ale cup slowly in his hands. He was not a man who performed his feelings for the benefit of rooms. 11 years of soldiering had stripped away most of the reflexive social responses that people use to signal their belonging. The automatic laugh, the agreeable nod, the expression shaped to match whatever the moment seemed to require. What remained was simply his actual face, which at that moment was quiet and attentive in a way that stood out from the surrounding noise the way a still pool stands out in moving water. Before dawn the next morning, Edric went to the butcher at the edge of town and asked about the bones and offcuts no one wanted. The butcher stared at him with open confusion, then pointed to the pile of waste at the back that otherwise fed only rats. Edric loaded as much as he could carry into a canvas sack without offering a single word of explanation. He had risen in the full dark, well before the inn stirred, moving through the cold corridor with the practiced quiet of a man long accustomed to early departures in conditions that did not invite noise. He had slept better than he expected, which sometimes happened when a decision had been made. The body, relieved of the low continuous effort of uncertainty, simply let go and rested in a way it couldn't manage while the mind was still negotiating with itself. The town was not yet awake when he stepped outside. The cold received him immediately, sharp and thorough, the kind that found the gaps in a coat and treated them as invitations. The street was empty in both directions, the buildings dark, the only movement a thin curl of smoke from the bakehouse chimney, where someone had already begun the first fire of the day. Edric oriented himself and walked toward the edge of town where the butcher's shop sat at the end of the market row, identifiable even in the dark by the particular quality of its smell. Soren the butcher was already at work when Edric arrived, which did not surprise him. Men in trades that began with killing tended to start early, before the rest of the world had fully committed to being alive. He was a compact, deficient man who wore his apron like armor and spoke in the short declarative sentences of someone who had long ago decided that most conversations could be improved by being considerably shorter. He looked up from his block when Edric pushed open the door, assessed him in a single practiced glance, and waited. Edric asked his question simply and directly, the way he also packed a small loaf of brown bread from his own meager supplies, though a dragon had no use for bread. A woman he had once known had taught him that you do not sit down with someone without bringing something of your own. Especially, she had said, when it is only bread, especially then. The loaf was 3 days old and had not been especially impressive when it was fresh. It was the dense, dark kind that kept longer than it tasted good, the sort of bread that existed less as pleasure and more as argument against starvation. Practical, honest, utterly without pretension. Edric had been rationing it alongside the inn's meals, the habit of a man who had spent enough hungry stretches to never quite trust that the next meal was guaranteed simply because the last one had arrived on schedule. Yet he held it for a moment before placing it in his coat, turning it over in his hands in the thin pre-dawn light coming through the small window of his room. By any reasonable accounting, it was a foolish thing to bring. The dragon needed meat, needed substantial calories in quantities that this single modest loaf could not begin to address. It would not help. It would not heal anything or change anything in any practical, measurable sense. He packed it anyway because of Marin. She had been his mother's closest friend, a woman of no particular social standing and very specific personal convictions, who had raised 3 children alone after her husband had not come back from a border skirmish when Edric was 7. She had fed those children and 2 neighboring children whose own circumstances were difficult with a consistency that impressed everyone who witnessed it, and she had done it without theater or self-congratulation, simply as the baseline expression of how she believed people ought to behave toward one another. She had told him the thing about bread when he was 11, on the occasion of his first visit to a neighbor who had fallen ill, and to whom. The ridge road was steep and the sack was heavy, and the cold bit through his coat the whole way up. Edric did not stop, did not slow, moved with the steady mechanical endurance of a man long practiced at doing hard things alone. When he broke through the tree line, the dragon was already watching him with wide amber eyes. The road began reasonably enough, a packed dirt track wide enough for a single cart, winding upward through the lower woodland where the trees still provided some shelter from the wind. Edric settled into his pace early and committed to it, the sack riding on his right shoulder, his left hand free, his breath coming in steady visible clouds that the cold air swallowed almost immediately. He had learned a long time ago that the opening stretch of a hard physical effort was where most people made their critical mistake, starting too fast, burning the early energy that needed to be spread across the whole distance, arriving at the difficult middle section already depleted. He had made that mistake himself years ago and had learned it thoroughly enough to never repeat it. The road steepened past the first bend and the trees thinned, taking the wind shelter with them. The cold came in properly then, the kind that did not gust but simply pressed, a steady, insistent weight against every exposed surface, finding the gap at his collar and the worn patch on his left sleeve with the thorough patience of something that had all day and knew it. His fingers tightened on the sack strap. He did not adjust his pace. There was a particular mental place Edric could go on hard physical efforts, a kind of interior room with no windows, where the discomfort was acknowledged and then set aside not through denial, but through a deliberate reallocation of attention. He had discovered it during his second year of service on a forced march through mountain terrain in weather considerably worse than this. When the alternative to finding that interior, Edric set the sack down without ceremony, sat on a flat rock, and began laying out the meat and bones like a man setting a table. He tore the brown loaf in half, placed one half beside the pile, and held the other half in his own hand. Then he looked up at Vareth and simply waited, making no grand gesture, speaking no word. He had thought, on the walk up, about how he would handle the arrival. Not in the tactical sense. He was not afraid, or not afraid in the way that required a plan, but in the simpler social sense of how one approaches a situation for which there is no established protocol. There was no tradition he knew of for this, no guidebook on the correct manner of presenting a meal to a creature older than the kingdom, no etiquette inherited from anyone who had attempted it before him, or at least attempted it and thought the etiquette worth recording afterward. He had decided, somewhere around the second bend in the road, that the absence of protocol was actually the answer. He would simply behave as he would behave. He would set things down and sit and arrange what he had brought with the same straightforward attention he would give to any meal in any circumstances. And he would let the actions speak in whatever language they were capable of speaking without dressing them in anything additional. The flat rock he chose was near enough to the pile to make the intention clear, and far enough from Vareth's granite shelf to avoid anything that could be read as an encroachment. He set the sack down first, and the impact of it against the stone carrying a satisfying solidity that the cold morning air delivered cleanly in all directions. Then he sat, unhurried, and opened the sack and began. He laid the bones out with genuine care. Not the performative care of someone constructing a display, but the practical care of a man who believed that the manner in which you prepared something for another person was itself a form of communication. Oper. Vareth stared at him for a long time, searching for the trick, for the mockery dressed in quiet clothes. He had lived long enough to know that human kindness almost always had a hidden room with a door that locked from the outside. But in this man's tired face he found nothing hidden, only weight and stillness, and the simple act of sitting down. He had encountered human kindness before, in the centuries behind him, and he had learned to read it the way a man who has been bitten enough times learns to read the particular stillness of a dog before it moves. Real kindness existed. He did not doubt that, had witnessed enough of it across enough generations to accept it as a genuine feature of the species rather than an aberration. But it rarely arrived without something riding underneath it, and some secondary current of need or agenda or the specific human desire to feel good about oneself that transformed the giving into a transaction with the receiver cast, without their consent, in the role of the thing that made the giver feel generous. He had been the object of that particular kindness more times than he cared to count. It had a recognizable texture. It came with a brightness in the eyes that was more about the giver than the given, a slight forward lean of the body, an expectation of response that was so deeply embedded in the gesture that the giver was rarely even aware it was there. It wanted something back, gratitude performed at the right volume, or the visible relief that confirmed the giver's own benevolence to themselves, or simply the acknowledgement that yes, you are the kind of person who does this, and yes, that matters, and yes, I see it. Vareth had given those responses, in his weaker moments, because the hunger made compromise of things that fullness would have refused. He searched for all of it now in the man sitting on the flat rock below his shelf, reading the face with the thoroughness of a creature who had spent centuries. The dragon descended from his granite shelf slowly, with what dignity his trembling limbs could hold. And he ate. He ate everything, with the focused efficiency of an ancient creature that had gone far too long without, and when it was gone he sat in silence. Across from him, the human chewed his half of the bread and looked out over the valley without asking anything at all. The descent took longer than it once would have. Each step down from the granite shelf required a negotiation between intention and capacity that Vareth conducted entirely internally, without allowing any of it to reach his face or his bearing. His front left leg, the one that had taken a lance through the joint in a battle so old the kingdom that had sent the night no longer existed, that trembled with the particular fine vibration of muscle asked to perform beyond its current means. He managed it. He set each foot with care and arrived at the level ground of the ridge without stumbling, which was the only standard he was applying to the effort. He approached the arranged pile without rushing, which required more conscious effort than the descent had, because the smell of real meat after 3 months was doing things to his composure that dignity had to work hard to counteract. He had a specific horror of appearing desperate in front of witnesses, a pride so old and so deeply structural that even now, even here, even with his ribs pressing against his scales and his legs shaking under him, it insisted on being consulted before he did anything that could be observed. He ate with his eyes down, not from shame exactly, but from the particular privacy that hunger at its most extreme requires, the same privacy that makes people turn away from mirrors when they are at their lowest points. Not because they cannot bear to be seen, but because there are moments of pure animal need that feel like they belong to a self more fundamental than the one available for public presentation. And, after a long while, Vareth spoke in a voice like a millstone that hadn't turned in years. "You did not laugh," he said. "No," said Edric. "I've been the thing people laugh at," the soldier added after a moment. "Not the same way, but enough to know what it looks like on someone else." The words came up from somewhere deep in Vareth's chest, moving through the long, disused architecture of speech like water, finding its way through stone channels that had been dry for a season. His voice had always been low, in the way that very large things tend toward low registers, but there was an additional roughness to it now that had not been there in his better years. A texture of rust and long silence that he was aware of and could not help, and the vocal equivalent of everything else about him that had deteriorated past the point of easy restoration. He had not intended to speak first. He had intended, in the vague way he had been intending things lately without much confidence in outcomes, to simply sit and let the silence continue until the man left, and to carry whatever this had been in some private interior place where he kept the things that mattered too much to examine directly. But the words had arrived without consulting that intention, pulled up by something more immediate than planning. "You did not laugh." It was not a sophisticated observation. It was not the opening of a conversation he had composed or considered. It was simply the thing that was most true about the last hour, distilled to its irreducible core, and offered in the only form available to him at that moment, direct, undecorated, carrying in its plainness the full weight of how much the thing it described had mattered. The man's response came without hesitation and without elaboration, a single syllable that landed with the clean solidity of something that did not need more words around it to stand upright. Number Vareth absorbed it. He turned it over once in the manner of a creature. They sat together on the cold ridge as the morning opened wide around them, a man and a dragon, neither of them whole. Below, the village went about its business. The children said their rhyme, and the merchants traveled their road without looking up. But on the ridge there was only wind and shared silence, and two tired things that had, without fanfare or miracle, decided to see each other. The morning continued to open the way winter mornings open in high places, slowly, without warmth, the light arriving as a fact rather than a comfort, spreading itself across the granite and the frozen ground with the impersonal evenness of something that had no opinion about what it illuminated. It fell on Vareth's gray scales and found no shine left in them. It fell on Edric's worn coat and made no improvement. It fell on the empty canvas sack and the scattered remnants of the meal and the flat rock where a man sat holding the last of his bread, and it treated all of these things with the same vast indifference that Vareth had always found, in his better philosophical moments, to be one of the more honest things about the world. Below, Crestholm was fully awake now. He could see the movement in the market street, the small figures of people going about the particular business of a cold morning in a small town, the carrying and the selling and the collecting, the conversations held at doorways, the children released from households into the open air where they immediately organized themselves into the ancient human configurations of play and argument. He could hear faintly, carried up on the ridge wind in fragments, the sounds of it all. And beneath those sounds, at some point in the middle of the morning, the particular bright cadence of the rhyme, sung by voices too young to understand that a thing can hear what is said about it and carry the hearing for longer than the singers will be alive. Vareth listened to it without moving. It reached him,